Hey guys, imagine standing before a tomb sealed for over 4,000 years, the air thick with ancient dust. Your torch flickers across walls covered in hieroglyphs, and then you see it, a name, a cartouche, a pharaoh's eternal signature carved in stone. But this name appears in no history book. No museum celebrates their reign. The world has completely forgotten they ever existed. How is this possible? How can the ruler of the greatest civilization on Earth simply vanish from memory? Tonight, we uncover the lost dynasties of ancient Egypt. We meet the pharaohs who built kingdoms, commanded armies, and constructed monuments that crumbled into sand. These are not the famous names you learned in school. These are the hidden rulers, the forgotten kings, the pharaohs that time erased. Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It truly helps. I'm curious, where in the world are you right now, and what time is it? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Now settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Tonight, we travel back 5,000 years, to the birth of the pharaohs, to a time before the pyramids, when Egypt itself was being born. The story of Egypt's forgotten pharaohs begins not with a grand pyramid or golden mask, but with blood, ambition, and the unification of two ancient kingdoms. Long before the first stone was cut for the Great Pyramid, Egypt was not one nation. It was two. In the south stretched Upper Egypt, a land of narrow riverbanks pressed between harsh desert cliffs. Its people were farmers and warriors. Their crown was white, tall, and conical, symbolizing the lotus flower. In the north lay Lower Egypt, where the Nile split into 1,000 channels across the delta. Its people were traders and fishermen. Their crown was red, flat and square, representing papyrus. For centuries, these kingdoms existed side by side, sometimes trading, sometimes warring, but always separate. Around 3100 B.C., a king arose in Upper Egypt whose ambition could not be contained. Some texts call him Menes, others call him Nama. Scholars believe these may have been two names for the same man, or perhaps a father and son whose achievements merged in memory. This king led the armies of Upper Egypt north in a campaign of brutal conquest. Ancient ceremonial palettes show bound prisoners being executed, fortifications destroyed, and the king himself smashing enemy skulls with a mace. This was not peaceful unification. This was total conquest. When the dust settled, something unprecedented had occurred. For the first time, the entire length of the Nile was under single rule. The two lands had become one. The man who achieved this wore both crowns merged into a single double crown called the Pshent. He was no longer merely a king. He was the first pharaoh. The capital was established at Inbu Hedge, meaning white walls. The Greeks later called it Memphis. From this strategic position, the first pharaohs could control both valley and delta. It was a statement carved into geography. We are one nation now. But unification on the battlefield is one thing. Maintaining unity required something far more difficult. It required the invention of kingship itself. The concept of the pharaoh was unlike any rulership before. The king was not simply a military leader. He was divine. He was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, the bridge between gods and men. Every action was sacred. Every word was law. His presence maintained Ma'at, the cosmic order keeping the universe from chaos. This was the organizing principle of Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years. The pharaoh's divinity justified absolute authority. It gave meaning to the labor of millions. It transformed monument construction from vanity into sacred duty. The first dynasty, beginning around 3100 B.C., was a time of extraordinary creativity and brutal consolidation. These early kings invented nearly everything: the bureaucracy to collect taxes, the writing system to record transactions, the iconography to communicate power, and the ideology to justify rule. Yet even in this foundational dynasty, there are pharaohs nearly erased by time. After the great unifier came rulers shrouded in mystery. Aha, possibly Nama's son, is known from a handful of inscriptions. Djoser ruled what seems a long, prosperous reign, but we know almost nothing of his deeds. His tomb at Abydos was so revered that later Egyptians believed it held Osiris himself. Then came Den, a mid-First Dynasty pharaoh who ruled approximately 50 years. Den is one of the most forgotten significant rulers in Egyptian history, yet his reign was transformative. He was the first pharaoh to use the title King of Upper and Lower Egypt in official inscriptions, formalizing the double kingdom concept. He introduced innovations in tomb architecture, creating the first tomb with a stairway entrance rather than a simple pit, allowing elaborate burial chambers and richer grave goods. Den's reign was apparently stable and prosperous. Trade expeditions were sent to Sinai to mine turquoise. Military campaigns launched into Nubia, and Libya secured borders and acquired resources. The bureaucracy expanded, and hieroglyphic writing became more sophisticated. Yet despite his long reign and innovations, Den is barely remembered today. His name doesn't echo through history like Khufu or Ramesses. His tomb, once grand, was robbed in antiquity and damaged by early archaeologists who didn't understand what they were uncovering. The First Dynasty continued with rulers like Anagib and Semerkhet, whose reigns were shorter and accomplishments more obscure. The dynasty concluded with Ka'a, a king whose very existence was debated until archaeological evidence confirmed his reign in the early 20th century. Ka'a's tomb at Abydos is the most elaborate of the First Dynasty, suggesting a wealthy, powerful reign. Yet history records almost nothing of what he actually did. The transition to the Second Dynasty around 2890 B.C. was not smooth. This period is among the most mysterious in Egyptian history. The kingship may have passed to a rival family. There may have been civil conflict, a brief return to the old division between north and south. The Second Dynasty pharaohs are ghosts. Hotep Sekemwi, the founder, left behind a massive underground tomb complex beneath Saqqara, but no superstructure. We don't even know for certain where his burial chamber lies within the labyrinth of passages. His name means the two powers are at peace, strongly suggesting his reign followed conflict, possibly reconciliation between rival claimants. Raneb succeeded him, then Ninetja, whose name appears on a few stone vessels and jar ceilings. These kings ruled Egypt for decades, administering a complex state, directing building projects, conducting trade, waging war, yet their stories are lost. The bureaucratic records, if kept on papyrus, have long since turned to dust. The monuments they built were dismantled or buried by later generations. The later Second Dynasty is even more enigmatic. Kings with names like Weneg, Senej, and Seth-Peribsen appear in fragmentary inscriptions, but the order and length of their reigns remain uncertain. Some scholars believe there was a religious schism, a conflict between followers of Horus and followers of Seth, god of chaos. Seth-Peribsen's name is written with the Seth animal rather than the traditional Horus falcon, suggesting he broke with tradition profoundly. The dynasty ended with Khâsekemwy, whose name means the two powers arise. Like Hotep Sekemwy at the beginning, his name suggests reconciliation after conflict. His reign seems to have restored unity and order. His tomb at Abydos is the largest and most impressive of the early dynastic period, filled with storage chambers packed with pottery, stone vessels, copper tools, and food offerings meant to sustain him eternally. These forgotten rulers of the First and Second Dynasties achieved something remarkable. They inherited a newly unified kingdom that could easily have fractured. They held it together. They created the institutions of state, bureaucracy, writing, tax collection, legal framework. They established the religious ideology, making the pharaoh not just a king but a god on earth. They experimented with monumental architecture, building increasingly elaborate tombs at Abydos and Saqqara. These mastaba tombs, low rectangular structures with sloping sides and underground chambers, were prototypes for everything that came after. They learned, generation by generation, how to organize massive labor forces, how to cut and move enormous stone blocks, how to design structures for eternity. As the Second Dynasty drew to a close, Egypt stood on the threshold of something unprecedented. Stone construction techniques had been mastered. Divine kingship ideology was firmly established. The bureaucracy was sophisticated enough to mobilize vast resources. The stage was set for the next great leap. The pharaoh who would take that leap was Djoser, but he would not be the only pyramid builder of his age, though he would be the only one remembered. The Third Dynasty begins with a revolution in stone. For centuries, pharaohs had been buried in mastaba tombs, low rectangular structures of mud brick with underground chambers. These were impressive monuments covering areas as large as city blocks, but they were horizontal. They sprawled across the desert. They did not reach for the sky. All of that changed with Djoser. Djoser ascended to the throne around 2686 B.C., inheriting a stable, unified kingdom. His reign would last approximately 19 years, yet in that time he commissioned something so revolutionary it would define Egyptian civilization for the next 1,000 years: the First Pyramid. The Step Pyramid at Saqqara was not built by Djoser alone. History records his architect, Imhotep. In later centuries, Imhotep would be deified, worshipped as a god of wisdom and medicine. His reputation was so great the Greeks identified him with Asclepius. Yet during his lifetime, Imhotep was mortal, an extraordinarily brilliant mortal. Imhotep's genius lay in thinking vertically. The Step Pyramid began as a traditional mastaba, but Imhotep kept building upward. He added layers, each smaller than the one below, creating a stepped structure rising in 6 tiers to 204 feet. It was the tallest structure in the world, visible for miles, a mountain of white limestone connecting earth and sky. The complex was surrounded by an enormous rectangular enclosure wall stretching over a mile in perimeter. Inside were temples, shrines, courtyards, and ritual structures, all carved from stone to mimic earlier buildings made from wood, reeds, and mud brick. Imhotep was translating Egypt's architectural tradition from temporary materials into eternal stone. Djoser's Step Pyramid dominates our understanding of the Third Dynasty. It appears in every textbook, every documentary, every museum exhibition, but Djoser was not the only pharaoh of his dynasty to attempt pyramid construction. He was simply the only one who succeeded so spectacularly that his monument survived intact. The pharaoh who followed Djoser was named Sekhemkhet. His name means powerful of body, and he was probably Djoser's son or younger brother. Sekhemkhet's reign lasted only 6 or 7 years, but in that brief time, he attempted to match his predecessor's achievement. He commissioned his own pyramid at Saqqara, just southwest of Djoser's complex. Sekhemkhet's pyramid, if completed, would have been even larger than Djoser's. The base was planned at nearly 400 feet on each side, designed to rise in 7 tiers rather than 6. It would have been the largest building in the world, but it was never finished. The pyramid, now called the Buried Pyramid, rises only to about 23 feet, barely one layer of the planned 7. Construction stopped abruptly, possibly at Sekhemkhet's death. Without a living pharaoh to push the project forward, the work ceased. The partially built pyramid was abandoned, and over centuries it was buried beneath wind-blown sand and debris. The existence of Sekhemkhet's pyramid was completely forgotten. Ancient Egyptian records made no mention of it. Greek and Roman historians never knew it existed. It vanished so completely that modern scholars believed Sekhemkhet was merely a name in a king list, possibly fictitious. Then, in 1951, Egyptian archaeologist Zakaria Gonim was surveying the Saqqara Plateau when he noticed an unusual rectangular depression in the sand. Something about the shape intrigued him. He began to excavate, and what he found astonished the world. Beneath the sand lay foundations of an enormous enclosure wall, even larger than Djoser's. Inside was the base of a step pyramid. As Gonim dug deeper, he found inscriptions bearing Sekhemkhet's name. This was his lost pyramid, his bid for immortality, buried and forgotten for over 4,600 years. The most dramatic discovery came when Gonim's team located the entrance to underground burial chambers. They descended a long, sloping passage cut through bedrock, passing rooms still containing storage jars and stone vessels. At the passage end, they found the burial chamber, sealed with a rubble wall. Beyond that wall was something unprecedented, an alabaster sarcophagus, its lid still sealed with ancient mortar, untouched by tomb robbers. The archaeological team was electrified. An unviolated royal burial from the Third Dynasty, it would rival Tutankhamun's tomb. In June of 1954, before government officials and journalists, Zakaria Gonim carefully opened the sealed sarcophagus. It was empty. The sarcophagus contained nothing. Not a body, not grave goods, not even fragments suggesting anything had been placed inside. The mystery has never been solved. Some scholars believe Sekhemkhet died so suddenly his mummification couldn't be completed. Others suggest the pyramid was a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb with his body buried elsewhere. Still, others wonder if the sarcophagus was sealed empty as part of some ritual we don't understand. Sekhemkhet was not the only Third Dynasty pharaoh swallowed by sand. His successor, a king named Kaba, also attempted to build a step pyramid. Kaba's monument at Zayet el Aryan between Giza and Saqqara is now called the Layer Pyramid. Like Sekhemkhet's, it was never completed. Only the first 4 layers were built, rising about 65 feet. The burial chambers beneath were left unfinished, their passages ending in rough-hewn rock. Kaba's reign appears even shorter than Sekhemkhet's, perhaps only 4 years. His name appears in only a handful of inscriptions, and his pyramid was abandoned so thoroughly that later Egyptians didn't remember it was intended as a royal tomb. The Layer Pyramid, like the buried pyramid, simply disappeared from history, waiting beneath sand until modern archaeologists rediscovered it in the early 20th century. Why did these pyramids fail? Building a pyramid required enormous resources, thousands of workers, millions of stone blocks, skilled architects and engineers, and above all, decades of sustained effort. A pyramid was a multi-generational project that might begin in a pharaoh's first year and not be completed until near his death. For the project to succeed, the pharaoh had to live long enough. Djoser ruled 19 years, long enough for Imhotep to complete the step pyramid complex. But Sekhemkhet had only 6 or 7 years, and Kaba perhaps even less. When the pharaoh died, his successor faced a choice: continue building the previous king's monument or begin his own. The answer was almost always the same: start fresh. A new pharaoh wanted his own eternal monument, not to be remembered for finishing someone else's tomb. So unfinished pyramids were abandoned. Workers moved to new sites. Cut stone was sometimes repurposed. Half-built structures were left to the desert. This cycle of ambition and abandonment characterized the Third Dynasty. It was a time of architectural experimentation, of trial and error on a massive scale. The early pyramid builders were learning as they went. Not every experiment succeeded. By the end of the Third Dynasty around 2613 B.C., the technical and organizational challenges of pyramid construction had largely been solved. The experiments, the failures, the abandoned projects, these were not wasted efforts. They were learning experiences. Each unfinished pyramid taught the Egyptians something new about engineering, labor management, and stone properties. The Fourth Dynasty would take these lessons and create the most iconic structures in human history: the true, smooth-sided pyramids at Djoser and Giza. But that perfection came at a cost. As pyramids became larger and more perfect, they also became fewer. Only the most powerful pharaohs, ruling for decades, could complete them. Kings with shorter reigns, pharaohs who died young, their monuments remained forever unfinished, their names forgotten. Sekhemkhet and Kaba were not failed kings. Their reigns were successful. Egypt was prosperous, trade flourished, borders were secure. But they didn't live long enough. And in the harsh arithmetic of historical memory, that was enough to consign them to oblivion. Their unfinished pyramids stood as silent witnesses to dreams that fell just short. They were the forgotten pioneers, pharaohs who dared to build mountains, but whose mountains crumbled before completion. Yet even in failure, they contributed to Egypt's glory. Techniques developed during their reigns, lessons learned from their half-built pyramids, these became the foundation for later successes. The forgotten pharaohs were the shoulders upon which giants stood. The Fourth Dynasty brought pyramid construction to its absolute pinnacle. Sneferu built 3 massive pyramids. His son Khufu constructed the Great Pyramid at Giza, the largest stone structure ever built. Khafre added the Second Giza Pyramid and the Great Sphinx. Menkaure completed the Third Pyramid of Giza. These names are immortal. These monuments define ancient Egypt in the popular imagination. But the Old Kingdom lasted far longer than the Fourth Dynasty. It continued through the Fifth and Sixth Dynasties, spanning nearly 500 years total. And within those centuries ruled dozens of pharaohs whose names have been almost entirely forgotten, buried beneath the overwhelming fame of the Giza builders. The transition from the 4th to the 5th dynasty, around 2494 B.C., is shrouded in legend and mystery. Ancient Egyptian tales claim the first three kings of the 5th dynasty were not descendants of the previous royal family, but rather the sons of the sun god Ra himself, born to a priestess. Whether this legend masks a political coup, a change of dynasty through marriage, or simply represents religious propaganda, we cannot know for certain. What we do know is that the 5th dynasty pharaohs were deeply devoted to the worship of Ra. They built solar temples alongside their pyramids, massive open-air courtyards centered around enormous obelisks representing the sacred Benben stone, the primordial mound upon which Ra first stood at creation. These solar temples were as important as the pyramids themselves, perhaps even more so in the religious life of the kingdom. The founder of this new dynasty was Djoser. His name means "his soul is powerful," and his reign of approximately 7 years marked a dramatic shift in royal ideology. Djoser built his pyramid at Saqqara, near Djoser's step pyramid, but it was significantly smaller than the Great Pyramids of Giza. It rose to only about 160 feet, barely half the height of Khafre's pyramid. This reduction in size was not due to lack of resources or ambition. It was a deliberate choice. Djoser and his successors poured their wealth and labor not into ever larger pyramids, but into the construction of elaborate solar temples. The sun cult had become supreme. The pharaoh was no longer primarily the embodiment of Horus. He was now the son of Ra, and his duty was to honor his divine father above all else. Djoser's pyramid complex was innovative in other ways. He built a massive granite statue of himself, fragments of which were found by archaeologists. The head alone stood over 8 feet tall, suggesting the complete statue may have been nearly 30 feet high, one of the largest royal statues ever created in ancient Egypt. Yet, despite his innovations and his founding of a new dynasty, Djoser is barely remembered. His pyramid, poorly constructed with a rubble core, collapsed in antiquity. Today it's little more than a mound of debris. His solar temple was dismantled in later periods, its stones reused for other buildings. The 5th dynasty continued with rulers like Sahura, Neferekare, and Neferefere. These pharaohs built pyramids and solar temples, conducted trade expeditions to Punt and Byblos, and sent mining expeditions to Sinai. The famous Palermo stone, one of the most important sources for Old Kingdom history, records their deeds, the quantities of precious metals acquired, the numbers of foreign captives taken, the dimensions of ships built for trade and war. Yet today, their names mean nothing to the average person. Their pyramids at Abu Zir, though once magnificent, are now ruined mounds that few tourists visit. The solar temples they spent fortunes to build have vanished almost entirely. Only foundations remain, excavated by archaeologists in the 20th century and known to specialists alone. One of the most intriguing 5th dynasty pharaohs is Djedkare Isesi, who ruled for approximately 39 years in the mid-24th century B.C. His long reign was apparently stable and prosperous. He reformed the administration, reducing the power of the central government and increasing the authority of provincial governors. He sent trading expeditions throughout the known world. His pyramid at South Saqqara was substantial, though built with inferior materials that have not weathered time well. Djedkare made another significant change. He did not build a solar temple. Every 5th dynasty pharaoh before him had constructed one alongside his pyramid. Djedkare broke with this tradition. Was this a religious reform? A shift in political power? A simple matter of economics? We don't know. The silence of the sources is absolute. The 5th dynasty ended with Unas, whose reign of approximately 30 years concluded around 2375 B.C. Unas built a relatively small pyramid at Saqqara, unremarkable in size and construction. But inside that pyramid, something revolutionary occurred. For the first time in history, the walls of the burial chambers were covered with hieroglyphic texts, magical spells, hymns, and prayers meant to guide the pharaoh through the dangers of the afterlife and ensure his resurrection among the gods. These are the pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings in the world. They would be copied and adapted by later pharaohs for centuries. They would evolve into the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom and eventually into the famous Book of the Dead. Unas, a pharaoh whose name is barely known today, created a tradition that would define Egyptian religious thought for millennia. The Sixth Dynasty, beginning around 2375 B.C., saw the Old Kingdom reach its final flourishing before sliding into chaos. The dynasty's founder, Teti, ruled for approximately 12 years. Ancient sources claim he was assassinated by his own bodyguards, though the truth of this is uncertain. His pyramid at Saqqara is now a collapsed ruin, but its interior chambers contain beautifully preserved pyramid texts. An expansion of the tradition Unas began. Teti was succeeded by his son Pepi I, who ruled for approximately 40 years. Pepi's reign saw continued prosperity and the extension of Egyptian influence far up the Nile into Nubia. He sent military expeditions and trading missions. He married two sisters, both named Ankhes and Pepi, and both bore him sons who would become pharaohs. But here we encounter one of the strangest quirks of historical memory. Pepi I's pyramid at Saqqara was called Men Nefer Pepi, meaning Pepi's splendor is enduring. The city that grew around the pyramid complex took the same name, Men Nefer. Over centuries, this name evolved. The Greeks heard it as Memphis. The pyramid and the pharaoh are forgotten, but the name of the city endures. Modern Egypt itself, Misa in Arabic, derives from the ancient name Mizraim, which in turn comes from the Egyptian name for Memphis. The entire country is named after a forgotten pharaoh's pyramid. The Sixth Dynasty reached its climax and its doom with Pepi II, who ascended the throne as a child around 2784 B.C. Ancient sources claim he ruled for 94 years, making him the longest reigning monarch in human history. Modern scholars are skeptical of this figure, suggesting the true reign was probably closer to 64 years, but even this revised estimate makes him one of the longest ruling pharaohs. Pepi II inherited a stable, powerful kingdom. He died, leaving a state in chaos. What happened during his extraordinarily long reign? The evidence suggests a slow, gradual breakdown of central authority. The provincial governors, the nomarchs, had been growing increasingly powerful since Djedka's administrative reforms. Under Pepi II, they became virtually independent. They built elaborate tombs for themselves in their own provinces rather than at the royal necropolis. They stopped sending resources to the capital. They began to think of themselves not as servants of the pharaoh, but as rulers in their own right. Climate change may have played a role as well. Paleoclimatic evidence suggests the Sahara was becoming drier during this period. The Nile floods, so crucial to Egyptian agriculture, may have become less reliable. Famine weakened the state. Popular unrest grew. The divine pharaoh, who was supposed to maintain cosmic order and ensure the flood came perfectly each year, was failing in his sacred duty. When Pepi II finally died, probably in his 90s, the kingdom did not long survive him. His successors, pharaohs with names like Merenre II and Netjakarre, ruled for months or at most a few years each. One queen, Nitocris, may have ruled briefly in her own right, though the evidence is fragmentary. The Sixth Dynasty collapsed. The Old Kingdom, which had endured for 500 years and produced the most magnificent monuments in human history, came to an end. What followed is called the First Intermediate Period, a time of division and chaos lasting over a century. The central government at Memphis lost control. Provincial governors declared themselves independent kings. Different dynasties ruled simultaneously in different parts of Egypt. The Seventh Dynasty is barely attested and may be entirely legendary. The Eighth Dynasty produced a series of short-lived pharaohs ruling from Memphis, controlling little more than the immediate environs of the capital. These pharaohs of the collapse are the most forgotten of all. Names like Neferkare II, Neferkare Nebi, and Djedkare Shammai appear in fragmentary king lists, but we know virtually nothing about them. They built no pyramids. They left no monuments. They ruled a kingdom that was falling apart around them, trying desperately to maintain an order that no longer existed. They were pharaohs in name only, divine kings without kingdoms, watching helplessly as the world their ancestors built crumbled into sand. The glory of the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramids, the time when Egypt seemed eternal and unchanging was over. The pharaohs who had built those wonders were being forgotten even as their monuments still stood. The world was changing. Egypt was changing. And the forgotten kings of the old kingdom's decline would be buried not just in sand, but in the weight of 3,000 years of history that would remember only the pyramid builders and forget all the rest. From the chaos of the first intermediate period, Egypt slowly, painfully pulled itself back together. The process took over a century. It required warfare, diplomacy, and the will of strong rulers who refused to accept that the glory of the pharaohs was finished. The story of this reunification is dramatic and well documented, but the pharaohs who accomplished it, and many who ruled after, have been overshadowed by the more famous names of the new kingdom that came later. The reunification began in the south, in the city of Thebes, which would become one of the most important cities in Egyptian history. The local governors of Thebes, during the chaos of the first intermediate period, had consolidated power over Upper Egypt. They called themselves Pharaohs of the 11th Dynasty, though initially their kingdom was small, controlling little more than the southern portion of the Nile Valley. The ruler who truly began the process of reunification was Mentuhotep II, who came to power around 2110 B.C. His throne name, Nebhepeter, means the Lord of the Steering Oar, is Ra. The steering oar, the rudder that guides a ship, was a metaphor for leadership and control. The name was a statement of intent. He would guide Egypt back to order. Mentuhotep II's early reign was consumed by warfare. In the north, centered at Heracleopolis, another line of kings claimed to be the legitimate pharaohs. These were the rulers of the 10th dynasty, descendants of the governors who had controlled Lower Egypt during the collapse. For decades, the two lands were divided again, north against south, just as they had been before Narmer's unification 2,000 years earlier. The war between Thebes and Heracleopolis was brutal. Archaeological evidence from this period includes mass graves of soldiers, their bodies showing signs of violent death, crushed skulls, arrow wounds, severed limbs. This was not the organized warfare of professional armies. This was desperate, chaotic fighting for survival and supremacy. Around 2600 B.C., after approximately 14 years of warfare, Mentuhotep II finally defeated the northern kings and reunited Egypt under his rule. He would reign for another 30 years, consolidating power, restoring order, and beginning the cultural renaissance that would define the Middle Kingdom. He built a magnificent terraced mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari in Thebes, a structure so innovative and beautiful that 600 years later, Queen Hatshepsut would build her own famous temple directly next to it in deliberate imitation. Mentuhotep II should be remembered as one of the greatest pharaohs in Egyptian history. He reunited a divided land. He restored the power and prestige of the kingship. He inaugurated a golden age. Yet today, his name is barely known outside academic circles. He is overshadowed by the Old Kingdom pyramid builders before him and the New Kingdom warrior kings after him. He is a giant forgotten in the shadow of other giants. His successors fared even worse in historical memory. Mentuhotep III ruled for approximately 12 years. His reign was peaceful and prosperous. He sent trading expeditions to Punt, that mysterious land of incense and exotic goods located somewhere on the Red Sea coast, possibly modern Somalia or Yemen. He reopened the quarries and resumed monumental building projects. He strengthened Egypt's control over Nubia, yet he left no spectacular monuments, and history has almost entirely forgotten him. Mentuhotep IV ruled for approximately 7 years. His reign seems to have ended in violence, possibly a coup. The man who seized the throne from him was his vizier, his highest official, a commoner named Amenemhat, who declared himself pharaoh and founded the 12th dynasty around 1991 B.C. The 12th dynasty is considered by many Egyptologists to be the high point of Egyptian civilization. It was a time of political stability, economic prosperity, artistic achievement, and territorial expansion. The pharaohs of this dynasty were capable administrators and military leaders. They dug canals, built fortresses, conquered foreign lands, and created some of the finest art and literature in Egyptian history. yet most of them are almost completely unknown today. Amenemhat I, the dynasty's founder, ruled for approximately 29 years. He was a usurper, a man who had seized power by force, and he spent his reign consolidating his legitimacy. He moved the capital from Thebes back to the north, founding a new city near Memphis called Ichtawi, meaning Sizer of the Two Lands. He established a co-regency system, crowning his son as junior pharaoh while he still lived, ensuring a smooth succession and preventing the chaos that had destroyed the Old Kingdom. Despite his accomplishments, Amenemhat I met a violent end. Ancient Egyptian literature preserves a text called The Teaching of Amenemhat, supposedly his final words to his son, written after his death. In it, he describes being assassinated in his own palace. It was after supper, night had fallen, I had spent an hour of happiness. I was asleep upon my bed, having become weary, and my heart had begun to follow sleep. When weapons were brandished, I was like a snake of the desert. The assassination succeeded, but the careful planning of co-regency meant the kingdom did not fall into chaos. His son, Senusret I, was already pharaoh. The transition was smooth. The dynasty continued. Senusret I ruled for approximately 45 years, one of the longest and most successful reigns of the Middle Kingdom. He campaigned in Nubia, pushing Egypt's southern border far beyond the First Cataract. He built temples throughout Egypt, including a magnificent white limestone shrine at Karnak, the oldest structure still standing at that temple complex. He sent mining expeditions to Sinai and trading expeditions to Punt. His reign was the Middle Kingdom at its peak, yet Senusret I is barely remembered. His name is not taught in schools. His accomplishments are footnotes in history books. He built no pyramids comparable to Giza. He left no golden treasures like Tutankhamun. He won no spectacular battles like Ramesses II at Kadesh. He was simply an extraordinarily competent ruler who governed wisely for nearly half a century. And history forgot him. The dynasty continued with Amenemhat II and Senusret II, both capable rulers whose reigns saw continued prosperity. But it was Senusret III, ruling from approximately 1874 to 1855 B.C., who brought the 12th dynasty to its military and administrative pinnacle. Senusret III was a warrior pharaoh. He launched at least 4 major military campaigns into Nubia, crushing resistance and extending Egyptian control deep into what is now Sudan. He built a chain of massive mud brick fortresses along the Nile in Nubia, some of the most sophisticated military architecture of the ancient world. These fortresses had walls over 30 feet thick, complex gate systems, multiple defensive lines, and elaborate water access systems to withstand long sieges. Within Egypt, Senusret III undertook radical administrative reforms. He abolished the old system of powerful provincial governors that had weakened central authority during the late Old Kingdom. He replaced them with directly appointed officials who served at the pharaoh's pleasure and could be dismissed at will. This centralization of power created a more efficient bureaucracy and prevented the rise of independent power bases that could challenge the throne. Senusret III was so successful, so powerful, that later generations worshipped him as a god. In Nubia, he was deified during his own lifetime. Soldiers and officials left inscriptions at the fortresses he built, praising him as a divine protector. Centuries later, during the New Kingdom, Senusret III was still worshipped in Nubia as a god of the Cataract region. Yet today, outside academic circles, he is almost unknown. His fortresses in Nubia are remote and rarely visited. His pyramid at Djoser is a collapsed ruin. His administrative reforms, though they shaped Egyptian government for centuries, are not the stuff of popular history. He was one of the greatest pharaohs Egypt ever produced, and the modern world has almost entirely forgotten him. The 12th dynasty ended with Amenemhat III, who ruled for approximately 46 years from 1809 to 1763 B.C. His reign was the last great flourishing of the Middle Kingdom. He completed massive irrigation and land reclamation projects in the Fayum region, transforming marshland into fertile farmland. He built a huge complex at Hawara that the Greeks would later call the Labyrinth, describing it as more impressive than the pyramids themselves. Roman tourists would visit it centuries later, marveling at its 1,000 rooms and complex passages. Today, almost nothing remains. The labyrinth was dismantled in later periods, its stones reused, its memory preserved only in ancient descriptions. After Amenemhat III, the dynasty declined rapidly. Amenemhat IV ruled for approximately 9 years, leaving little mark on history. Then came Sobieneferu, a woman who ruled as pharaoh in her own right for approximately 4 years, around 1762 B.C. She was one of the first female pharaohs, predating the famous Hatshepsut by 300 years. She took all the traditional titles and regalia of kingship. Ancient art shows her wearing both the traditional female sheath dress and the male pharaoh's kilt simultaneously, a visual representation of her unique position. With Sobieneferu's death, the 12th dynasty ended. What followed was the 13th dynasty, and with it began the slow slide into the chaos of the Second Intermediate Period. The 13th dynasty is one of the most frustrating periods for historians. We have king lists showing over 50 pharaohs ruling over a period of approximately 150 years. Most reigned for less than 5 years. Some ruled for only months. Many are known only from a single inscription or scarab seal. These are the most forgotten pharaohs of all. Names like Sekhemkare Kutawi, Sekhemre Kutawi Pant-Jeni, and Neferhotep I. They ruled during a time when central authority was slowly collapsing again. The causes are debated climate change, causing agricultural problems, infiltration of foreign peoples from the Levant, internal political instability. Whatever the reasons, Egypt was fracturing. Some of these forgotten pharaohs were competent rulers who maintained order in their territories. Neferhotep I, ruling from approximately 1740 to 1730 B.C., controlled most of Egypt and conducted building projects at temples throughout the country. His brother Sobekotep IV had a similarly successful reign, but they were swimming against the tide of history. The unity and strength of the 12th dynasty could not be maintained. By 1700 B.C., Egypt was dividing again. In the north, in the Delta region, foreign rulers were establishing their own kingdom. These were the Hyksos, Semitic-speaking peoples from the Levant who had gradually infiltrated Egypt during the prosperity of the Middle Kingdom. Now they were seizing power. The Second Intermediate Period had begun. Egypt would be divided for over a century, and the forgotten pharaohs of the late Middle Kingdom would be buried beneath the weight of the invasions and chaos to come. Around 1700 B.C., something unprecedented occurred in Egyptian history. For the first time since the unification under Narmer 2,000 years earlier, Egypt was conquered by foreigners. The invaders were the Hyksos, and their story is one of the most controversial and misunderstood chapters in Egyptian history. The word Hyksos comes from the Egyptian term Heka Kasut, meaning rulers of foreign lands. The Egyptians used this term with contempt and fear. Later, Egyptian propaganda painted the Hyksos as barbarian invaders who swept down from the north, destroyed cities, burned temples, and ruled with tyrannical cruelty. The historian Manetho, writing in the 3rd century B.C., described their arrival as a catastrophe. Invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force they easily seized it without striking a blow. But archaeology tells a different story. The Hyksos were not savage barbarians. They were Semitic-speaking peoples from Canaan and Syria who had been migrating into the Egyptian delta for generations, initially as traders, workers, and settlers. During the prosperity of the 12th dynasty, the pharaohs had welcomed these immigrants. They worked Egyptian farms, served in Egyptian armies, and gradually established their own communities in the delta. As central authority weakened during the 13th dynasty, these foreign communities grew increasingly powerful. They controlled trade routes, they accumulated wealth, they built fortified cities, and eventually they declared their independence from the weak pharaohs ruling from the south. They established their own dynasty, the 15th dynasty, ruling from their capital at Avaris in the eastern delta. The Hyksos did not conquer Egypt through military invasion. They inherited control of Lower Egypt through a gradual process of immigration, economic dominance, and political fragmentation. But to the Egyptians of Upper Egypt, who still maintained an independent kingdom centered at Thebes, this was unacceptable. Foreign barbarians ruling the sacred land of Egypt, calling themselves pharaohs, wearing the double crown, this was an abomination that violated Ma'at itself. The first Hyksos ruler attested in Egyptian records is Salatis, though earlier kings almost certainly existed. Salatis established Avaris as his capital, fortifying it heavily. The city became one of the largest in the ancient Near East, a cosmopolitan center where Egyptian culture mixed with Canaanite, Syrian, and later Minoan influences. Archaeologists excavating Avaris have found Syrian-style temples alongside Egyptian sanctuaries, pottery from Cyprus and Crete alongside Egyptian ware, and weapons and artwork showing a fusion of styles. The Hyksos brought with them military innovations that would transform warfare throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Most importantly, they introduced the composite bow and the horse-drawn chariot to Egypt. The composite bow, made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew glued together, was far more powerful than the simple wooden bows Egyptians had used. It could shoot arrows with much greater range and penetrating power. The chariot was even more revolutionary. The Egyptians had never seen horses before the Hyksos arrival. These swift, mobile platforms carrying archers transformed battlefield tactics. A chariot force could move rapidly, strike from unexpected directions, and retreat before slower infantry could engage. The psychological impact was enormous. Imagine Egyptian soldiers, who had fought on foot for 2,000 years, suddenly facing a thunder of hooves and wheels, arrows raining down from fast-moving platforms they had no way to counter. The Hyksos adapted Egyptian royal ideology to legitimize their rule. They took traditional Egyptian throne names. They wrote their names in cartouches. They claimed the protection of Egyptian gods, particularly Seth, whom they identified with their own storm god Baal. They commissioned scarabs and monuments in Egyptian style, declaring themselves legitimate pharaohs. One of the most powerful Hyksos rulers was Kian, who ruled approximately from 1610 to 1610 B.C. Objects bearing his name have been found far beyond Egypt, in Crete, in Mesopotamia, in modern Turkey. These finds suggest the Hyksos maintained extensive trade networks throughout the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Kian may have been one of the most internationally connected rulers in the ancient world. But in Egypt itself, Kian and his fellow Hyksos kings were hated. The Theban pharaohs, ruling independently in Upper Egypt as the 16th and 17th dynasties, viewed the Hyksos as illegitimate usurpers. Egyptian texts from this period drip with contempt. The Hyksos are described as impure, as polluters of sacred sites, as enemies of the gods. This propaganda must be understood for what it was, the ideology of a resistance movement. The Thebans needed to delegitimize Hyksos rule to justify their war of reconquest. They portrayed the Hyksos as monstrous outsiders, even though the reality was far more complex. The Hyksos ruled Lower Egypt for over a century. Many Egyptians in the north accepted their rule, served in their administration, and prospered under their government. The longest reigning and most powerful Hyksos pharaoh was Apophis, who ruled for approximately 40 years, from 1600 to 1560 B.C. Apophis controlled not just the delta, but extended Hyksos influence deep into Middle Egypt. He established trade relationships throughout the Near East. He built temples and monuments. By any objective measure, his reign was successful and stable. But in the south, at Thebes, the 17th dynasty pharaohs were preparing for war. These Theban rulers with names like Intef, Tau, and Kamose are barely remembered today, overshadowed by their more famous New Kingdom successors. But they were the ones who began the long, brutal struggle to reunite Egypt and expel the Hyksos. The conflict began as border skirmishes and raids. Ancient texts preserve a story, probably legendary but perhaps containing a grain of truth, about how the war started. Apophis, ruling from Avaris in the far north, sent a message to the Theban king Tau, complaining that the hippopotamuses in the sacred pool at Thebes were making so much noise that he couldn't sleep in his palace hundreds of miles away. The message was obviously absurd, a deliberate insult meant to assert dominance. Tau's response was war. Seqenenre Tau ruled Thebes from approximately 1500 60 to 1555 B.C. He launched the first serious military campaign against the Hyksos. His mummy, discovered in the 19th century, tells a horrific story. His skull shows multiple devastating wounds, a crushing blow from an axe that fractured his cheek and jaw, a smashing impact that shattered his forehead, another blow that penetrated deep into his brain. These wounds match Hyksos weapons found at archaeological sites. Sekenenra Tau died violently in battle, probably captured and executed by Hyksos forces. His body was hastily mummified, perhaps on the battlefield itself, but his son Kamose continued the war. Kamose ruled for only approximately 3 years, from 1555 to 1552 B.C. But in that brief time he pushed north, conquering Middle Egypt and besieging Avaris itself. Kamose's war bulletin, carved on 2 massive stone stelae erected at Karnak, preserves his own words describing the campaign. He speaks with fierce pride of attacking Hyksos territories, capturing their ships, destroying their orchards, and driving them back to their fortified capital. He describes intercepting a message from Apophis trying to forge an alliance with the Nubian kingdom to the south, attempting to trap Thebes between 2 enemies. Kamose prevented this alliance and continued his offensive, but Kamose did not live to see final victory. He died young, possibly in battle like his father. The war to liberate Egypt would be completed by his younger brother Ahmose, who would found the 18th dynasty and usher in the new kingdom. But that story belongs to the next chapter of Egyptian history. The Hyksos themselves, after their defeat and expulsion around 1550 B.C., vanished from history. They retreated to Canaan, their homeland, and were absorbed back into the populations of the Levantine cities. Their capital Avaris was destroyed, rebuilt by the Egyptians, and eventually abandoned. Their monuments were defaced, their names erased from inscriptions, their memory deliberately destroyed by vengeful Egyptian scribes who wanted to erase this shameful period from history. Later, Egyptian propaganda was so successful that for millennia the Hyksos were remembered only as barbaric invaders, if they were remembered at all. Only in the modern era has archaeology revealed the truth. They were sophisticated rulers who adopted Egyptian culture, maintained extensive trade networks, and governed successfully for over a century. They introduced technologies that transformed Egyptian civilization. The chariots and composite bows that later New Kingdom pharaohs would use to build an empire came from the Hyksos. Yet the Hyksos pharaohs remained forgotten. Salatis, Kian, Apophis. These names mean nothing to most people today. They are footnotes in Egyptian history, foreigners who briefly interrupted the proper order before being expelled. They are the ultimate forgotten pharaohs, powerful, successful rulers who governed one of the most important regions on earth, yet who were deliberately written out of history by their conquerors. Their story is a reminder that history is written by the victors, and that those who lose are often forgotten entirely, no matter how significant their actual achievements. While the Hyksos ruled the delta from their capital at Avaris, the story of the native Egyptian resistance was being written in blood and determination far to the south. The 17th dynasty of Thebes, ruling from approximately 1600 to 1550 B.C., represents one of the most heroic periods in Egyptian history. Yet ironically, these pharaohs who fought to restore Egyptian independence are among the most forgotten rulers of all. The 17th dynasty began not as a great power, but as a small regional kingdom, controlling little more than the area around Thebes and the southernmost portion of Upper Egypt. To their north lay the Hyksos kingdom. To their south, the Nubians had established their own independent kingdom, taking advantage of Egypt's weakness to reclaim territories that had been under Egyptian control during the Middle Kingdom. The early 17th dynasty pharaohs were trapped between these two powers, ruling a truncated Egypt reduced to a fraction of its former glory. They called themselves kings of Upper and Lower Egypt, wearing the double crown and claiming to be legitimate pharaohs, but the reality was far more modest. They ruled perhaps a quarter of the territory their Middle Kingdom predecessors had controlled. The dynasty's early rulers are barely known. Intef V, Intef VI, and Intef VII ruled in succession, their reigns short and their accomplishments unrecorded. They maintained order in their small kingdom, They kept the ancient traditions alive. They prepared, slowly and patiently, for the day when Egypt might be reunified. But history has almost entirely forgotten them. The archaeological evidence for these early 17th dynasty pharaohs is heartbreakingly sparse. Their tombs at Thebes were modest, nothing like the grand pyramids of the Old Kingdom, or even the substantial tombs of the Middle Kingdom. They could not afford monumental architecture. Every resource had to be conserved, every worker potentially needed for military service. These were pharaohs living in reduced circumstances, maintaining the dignity of kingship while knowing their kingdom was a shadow of what it should be. One of the few 17th dynasty rulers about whom we know anything substantial is Nubkepera-Intef. His coffin, discovered in the 19th century, was beautifully crafted and covered with religious texts. But the coffin was reused from an earlier period, carefully redecorated for its new occupant. Even a pharaoh could not afford a newly made royal coffin. The poverty of the Theban kingdom is evident in every archaeological find. Yet these pharaohs never abandoned their claim to be the true rulers of all Egypt. Their official inscriptions proclaimed them kings of Upper and Lower Egypt, lords of the two lands. In their hearts, and in their propaganda, the division of Egypt was temporary, an aberration that would be corrected. The Hyksos in the north were usurpers, foreigners who had stolen what rightfully belonged to the Egyptian crown. One day, perhaps not in their lifetime but in their sons' or grandsons', Egypt would be whole again. The turning point came with Seqenenre-Tao, called Tao the Brave by later generations. He came to power around 1560 B.C., inheriting a kingdom that had been at peace with the Hyksos for decades. The arrangement was pragmatic. The Hyksos controlled the north, the Thebans controlled the south, and both sides maintained a wary coexistence. But Tao was not content with coexistence. Ancient texts preserve a story about the beginning of the war. Apophis, the Hyksos pharaoh ruling from avarice, sent messengers to Thebes with an absurd complaint. The hippopotamuses in the sacred pool at Thebes were so loud that Apophis could not sleep in his palace hundreds of miles away in the delta. The message was obviously a pretext, a deliberate provocation designed to humiliate the Theban king and force him to acknowledge Hyksos supremacy. Tao's response was war. Whether this story is historical fact or later legend, we know that Seqenenre-Tao launched a military campaign against the Hyksos. We also know how it ended. His mummy, discovered in the Deir el-Bahari cache in 1881, is one of the most horrifying archaeological finds in Egyptian history. Tao's skull shows evidence of at least 5 separate wounds, all inflicted at or near the time of death. A blow from a Hyksos battle axe crushed his left cheek and jaw. Another axe blow shattered his right forehead, penetrating deep into the brain. A dagger thrust pierced his neck below the left ear. A mace blow fractured his nose. These wounds were not received in honorable combat from the front. The angles suggest Tao was on his knees or lying down when the fatal blows were struck. He may have been captured in battle and executed, or he may have fallen wounded and been killed where he lay. His body was hastily mummified, probably on or near the battlefield. The embalmers did not have time or resources to do a proper job. The brain was not removed. The body was not properly dried. The wrappings were carelessly applied. Everything about Tao's mummy speaks of a desperate situation. A king killed in battle, his body recovered by his followers and hastily preserved so it could be brought home to Thebes for burial. But though Seqenenre-Tao died in defeat, his war continued. His sons took up the fight. The elder son, Kamose, became pharaoh around 1555 B.C. He was probably in his 20s, young and burning with desire to avenge his father and liberate Egypt. Kamose's reign lasted only 3 years, but they were 3 years of intensive warfare. 2 great stone stelae, erected at Karnak Temple, preserve portions of Kamose's war bulletin, his own account of the campaign written in vivid, aggressive language that reveals his personality across 35 centuries. Kamose describes how his council of advisors urged him to maintain peace with the Hyksos, arguing that the current situation was tolerable. Kamose rejected their advice with contempt. He declared he would not rest while a foreigner ruled in avarice. He would not accept a divided Egypt. He would fight until the Hyksos were driven out or until he died trying. The bulletin describes Kamos's campaign in detail. He sailed north with his fleet, attacking Hyksos positions along the Nile. He captured their ships and destroyed their cargo. He conquered Middle Egyptian cities that had submitted to Hyksos rule. He reached the outskirts of Avaris itself and fought battles beneath the walls of the Hyksos capital. In one dramatic passage, Kamose describes intercepting a messenger carrying a letter from Apophis to the king of Nubia, proposing an alliance against Thebes. Apophis wrote urging the Nubian king to attack Thebes from the south, while the Hyksos pressed from the north, crushing the Theban kingdom between them like a nut in a vice. Kamose captured this messenger in the western desert and seized the letter. He sent troops south to secure the Nubian border, preventing the alliance from forming. Kamose pushed the Hyksos back to the delta, but he could not capture Avaris itself. The city's fortifications were too strong, and the Hyksos still commanded a powerful army. The war reached a stalemate, and then, around 1552 B.C., Kamose died. The cause of his death is unknown. He may have died in battle like his father. He may have died of illness or accident. We simply don't know. What we do know is that Kamose had no sons. The throne passed to his younger brother, a boy of perhaps 10 years old, named Ahmose. And with Ahmose begins a new era. But that story belongs to the new kingdom, not to the forgotten pharaohs of the 17th dynasty. The 17th dynasty rulers, the Intefs, Seqenen-Retau, and Kamose, are the forgotten heroes of Egyptian history. They kept the flame of Egyptian independence alive through the darkest period since the First Intermediate Period. They maintained the traditions and ideology of Egyptian kingship even when their kingdom was reduced to a fraction of its former size. They fought and died to reunite Egypt, and though they did not live to see victory, they made that victory possible. Yet their names are barely known today. They built no great monuments. They left no golden treasures. They ruled a poor kingdom that could barely afford to bury its kings properly. The great achievements of the new kingdom, the empire, the wealth, the magnificent temples, all rest on the foundation these forgotten pharaohs built. But history remembers Ahmose as the founder of the 18th dynasty and the liberator of Egypt. History has largely forgotten the father and uncle who fought the same war before him and died without seeing victory. The tombs of these 17th dynasty pharaohs, modest and poor, still exist at Thebes. Tourists walk past them every day, drawn to the more spectacular tombs of the Valley of the Kings nearby. The mummies of Tau and Kamose lie in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, their violent deaths written on their broken bones. They are witnesses to a forgotten chapter of Egyptian history, a time when being pharaoh meant not luxury and power, but struggle and sacrifice, and the very real possibility of dying violently in a war to restore what had been lost. These were the last of Egypt's forgotten pharaohs to rule a divided land. After them came the new kingdom, when Egypt would be united and powerful again. But the price of that unity was paid in the blood of these forgotten kings, and their sacrifice should be remembered. The 18th dynasty began with Ahmose, who completed the liberation his father and uncle had begun, driving the Hyksos from Egypt and reuniting the two lands around 1550 B.C. The new kingdom that followed would last 500 years, the longest period of continuous unity and power in Egyptian history. It was the age of empire, when Egyptian armies marched into Syria and Nubia, when gold flowed into Egypt from conquered territories, when massive temple complexes were built that still astound visitors today. The new kingdom gave us the most famous names in Egyptian history: Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh who ruled as a king; Thutmose III, the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, who campaigned in 17 military expeditions and created the largest empire Egypt ever controlled; Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who tried to overthrow 3,000 years of religious tradition; Tutankhamun, the boy king whose intact tomb revealed treasures beyond imagination; Ramesses II, who ruled for 67 years and covered Egypt with monuments proclaiming his greatness. These names are immortal. But between them, before them, and after them, ruled dozens of other pharaohs, whose accomplishments were substantial, but whose names have been forgotten. The brightness of the famous few has cast the many into shadow. Consider Amenhotep I, who ruled from approximately 1525 to 1504 B. c. He was Ahmose's son, the second pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. His 21-year reign was peaceful and prosperous. He campaigned in Nubia, securing Egypt's southern border. He initiated building projects at Karnak Temple that would be continued by his successors for centuries. He established the workmen's village at Deir el-Medina, the community of skilled artisans who would build and decorate the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Most significantly, Amenhotep I may have been the first pharaoh to separate his mortuary temple from his actual tomb, hiding his burial place in a secret location in the cliffs of western Thebes. This innovation would become standard practice for all New Kingdom pharaohs. The Valley of the Kings itself may have been Amenhotep's creation. Later generations worshipped Amenhotep I as a god, the patron deity of the Deir el-Medina workmen's community. For over 1,000 years, the people of Thebes celebrated an annual festival in his honor. Yet today, outside academic circles, his name is barely known. He is overshadowed by Hatshepsut, who came later, by Thutmose III, who achieved greater military glory, by all the brighter stars of the 18th dynasty. His successor, Thutmose I, ruled for approximately 12 years and pushed Egyptian power to its greatest extent yet. He campaigned deep into Nubia, reaching the fourth cataract of the Nile, farther south than any pharaoh before him. He marched into Syria, crossing the Euphrates River and setting up a boundary stele proclaiming Egyptian dominion. He was the first pharaoh to be buried in the Valley of the Kings, in a tomb cut deep into the rock and hidden from tomb robbers. Thutmose I was a successful warrior king who expanded Egypt's empire and secured its borders. Yet he is remembered, if at all, primarily as Hatshepsut's father. His own achievements are footnotes to his daughter's more famous reign. After Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, the dynasty continued with Amenhotep II, who ruled from approximately 1427 to 1401 B.C. Ancient texts praise his physical prowess. He was supposedly the strongest man in Egypt, able to shoot arrows through thick copper targets that no other man could pierce. He was an athlete and warrior, personally leading his chariot into battle during campaigns in Syria. Amenhotep II was brutal in warfare. One inscription describes how he executed 7 Syrian princes with his own hand, then hung 6 of their bodies on the walls of Thebes and sent the 7th to Nubia to be displayed there as a warning. This was not the civilized warfare of later centuries. This was terror as policy, designed to make Egyptian power so fearsome that rebellion became unthinkable. His reign was successful. He maintained the empire his predecessors had built. He kept the Asiatic kingdoms in line through a combination of military intimidation and diplomatic marriages. He built temples and monuments. Yet Amenhotep II is almost entirely forgotten today, overshadowed by the more famous rulers before and after him. The dynasty continued through Thutmose IV, Amenhotep III, and then came the crisis of the Amarna period, Akhenaten's religious revolution, the brief reign of Smenkhare, the restoration under Tutankhamun, and the cleanup under Ai and Horemheb. This period is well documented and much studied. But even here, in the most famous period of the 18th dynasty, there are forgotten pharaohs. Ai ruled for approximately 4 years, from 1323 to 1319 B.C. He was an elderly courtier, possibly Tutankhamun's great-uncle, who may have maneuvered himself onto the throne after the boy king's death. Ancient art shows Ai performing Tutankhamun's burial rites, a ritual normally reserved for a son or designated heir. This has led to speculation that Ai usurped the throne, perhaps even arranging Tutankhamun's death, though no evidence proves this. Ai's brief reign was spent trying to restore stability after the chaos of the Amarna period. He continued, the religious counter-revolution begun under Tutankhamun, fully restoring the old gods and temples that Akhenaten had tried to destroy. He conducted limited military campaigns to reassert Egyptian authority in territories that had become restive during the religious upheaval. Then he died, probably in his 70s, and was buried in a modest tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Ai is remembered today only because of his connection to Tutankhamun. Few people know his name. Fewer still know anything about his reign. He is a transitional figure, a brief pause between the famous Tutankhamun and the powerful Horemheb who came after. Horemheb ruled from approximately 13 19 to 1292 B.C., a reign of about 27 years. He was a commoner, a successful general who seized the throne when I died without an heir. Horemheb completed the dismantling of Akhenaten's religious revolution, systematically destroying Amarna period monuments and erasing the heretic pharaoh's name from history. He reformed the army, reorganized the bureaucracy, and restored order to a state that had been shaken by decades of religious and political turmoil. Horemheb was a capable administrator and a strong ruler. Later king lists often begin the 19th dynasty with him rather than with Ramesses I, treating him as the true restorer of proper order, yet he is barely remembered today. He left no golden treasures. He fought no famous battles. He simply governed competently, cleaned up the mess left by his predecessors, and prepared Egypt for the next dynasty. The 19th dynasty began with Ramesses I, an elderly vizier chosen by Horemheb as his successor. Ramesses I ruled for less than 2 years, barely long enough to establish his dynasty before dying of old age. His son Seti I ruled for approximately 11 years, from 1290 to 1279 B.C. Seti I was one of the great warrior pharaohs. He campaigned extensively in Syria and Palestine, reasserting Egyptian control over territories that had drifted toward independence during the late 18th dynasty. He fought against the Hittite Empire, the great power of Anatolia, battling for control of Syria. He reconquered parts of Nubia. He built extensively at Karnak and Abydos, creating some of the most beautiful temple reliefs in Egyptian history. His mortuary temple at Abydos contains the famous Abydos King List, one of our most important sources for the sequence of Egyptian pharaohs. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings is the longest and one of the most beautifully decorated. By any measure, Seti I was a great pharaoh, a successful warrior and builder who ruled during a time of prosperity and power. Yet he is completely overshadowed by his son, Ramesses II. Seti I's accomplishments are forgotten. His name is barely known. He is remembered, if at all, as the father of Ramesses the Great. The son's glory has eclipsed the father's achievements. Ramesses II himself, ruling from 1279 to 1213 B.C., is one of the few New Kingdom pharaohs who is not forgotten. His 67-year reign, his massive building projects, his self-promotion on a scale never seen before or since, ensured his immortality. But after Ramesses, the dynasty continued for another century with a succession of pharaohs named Ramesses who ruled during Egypt's slow decline. Ramesses III, of the 20th dynasty, ruled from approximately 1186 to 1155 B.C. He was the last great warrior pharaoh, defending Egypt against massive invasions by the Sea Peoples, mysterious groups of raiders, and displaced populations that were destroying kingdoms throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Ramesses III defeated them in a series of land and sea battles, saving Egypt from the Bronze Age collapse that destroyed the Hittite Empire and devastated the Levantine cities. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu contains detailed reliefs showing these battles, Egyptian ships ramming invader vessels, archers shooting from the rigging, drowned sailors floating in the sea. These are some of the most vivid war scenes in Egyptian art. Ramesses III saved Egyptian civilization, yet he is barely remembered today, overshadowed by his more famous predecessor, Ramesses II. After Ramesses III, the 20th dynasty continued with a succession of weak rulers all named Ramesses, the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th. They ruled during a period of slow decline, their reigns short and ineffective. Foreign invasions continued. The government became corrupt. The priests of Amun at Karnak grew so powerful they rivaled the pharaoh himself. Tomb robberies became endemic as poverty spread. These late Ramessides are the most forgotten pharaohs of the New Kingdom. They ruled during the decline, watching helplessly as the empire their ancestors had built crumbled away. They built little, achieved little, and died leaving Egypt weaker than they found it. History has forgotten them because they failed, because they presided over loss rather than gain, because they could not maintain what their predecessors had achieved. The New Kingdom ended around 1069 B.C., not with drama, but with a whimper. The last Ramesses was peacefully succeeded by Smendes, who founded the 21st dynasty and moved the capital to the delta. The great age of empire was over. Egypt would never again achieve the power and glory it had known during the 18th and 19th dynasties. The overlooked pharaohs of the new kingdom, Amenhotep I, Thutmose I, Amenhotep II, Seti I, Ramesses III, and all the others were not failures. They were successful rulers who governed during a time of Egyptian greatness, but they had the misfortune to rule alongside or near figures of such overwhelming fame that history forgot them. They are the supporting cast members in a drama where only the starring roles are remembered. After the glory of the new kingdom faded, Egypt entered a period historians call the Third Intermediate Period, lasting from approximately 1069 to 664 B.C. It was a time of division, foreign rule, and multiple kingdoms claiming legitimacy. The pharaohs of this era are among the most forgotten in Egyptian history, yet their stories reveal a fascinating truth. Egyptian civilization was so prestigious, so culturally powerful, that even foreign conquerors desperately wanted to be Egyptian. The 21st dynasty, ruling from the delta city of Tanis while high priests governed Thebes in the south, maintained a facade of unity that fooled no one. Egypt was divided, and both halves were weak. The pharaohs in the north controlled little beyond the delta. The priest-kings in the south ruled Upper Egypt as an independent theocracy. This division invited foreign intervention. The intervention came from Libya. For centuries, Libyan tribes from the western desert had been infiltrating the delta, settling in Egyptian territory, serving as mercenaries in Egyptian armies. By the 10th century B.C., they dominated the military. When the 21st dynasty ended without an heir around 945 B.C., a Libyan general named Shoshenq simply declared himself pharaoh and founded the 22nd dynasty. Shoshenq I, ruling from approximately 945 to 924 B.C., was a capable ruler who briefly restored some of Egypt's power. He campaigned in Palestine, sacking Jerusalem and plundering the Temple of Solomon around 926 B.C., an event mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. He built extensively at Karnak, adding a massive gateway and courtyard. He reunited Egypt under his control, ending the division between Tanis and Thebes. For a brief moment, it seemed Egypt might recover its former glory under this energetic foreign dynasty. But Shoshenq's successors lacked his ability. The 22nd dynasty continued with pharaohs named Osorkon and Taklot, but central authority gradually weakened. By the 8th century B.C., Egypt had fractured into a patchwork of rival kingdoms. Multiple pharaohs ruled simultaneously, each controlling a few cities, none powerful enough to dominate the others. This period is so confusing that Egyptologists still debate the sequence and dating of rulers. The 23rd dynasty overlapped with the 22nd, ruling from a different delta city. The 24th dynasty appeared briefly in the western delta. Local rulers in various cities declared themselves pharaohs, wearing the double crown and taking royal titles, even though they controlled territories smaller than many ancient Egyptian provinces. These Libyan pharaohs adopted Egyptian culture completely. They took Egyptian throne names. They wrote in hieroglyphs. They worshipped Egyptian gods. They built temples in Egyptian style. To look at their monuments, you would never know they were foreigners. They had become Egyptian in everything but blood, more Egyptian perhaps than some native-born Egyptians who by this time were deeply influenced by centuries of foreign contact. Yet despite their cultural assimilation, despite their adoption of all the forms and traditions of Egyptian kingship, these Libyan pharaohs are almost completely forgotten. Names like Osorkon II, Taklot II, and Shoshenq III appear only in specialist academic works. They ruled Egypt for over 2 centuries, but history has erased them as thoroughly as if they never existed. While the Libyan dynasties were fragmenting in the north, a new power was rising in the south. Nubia, which Egypt had controlled and exploited for 2,000 years, had developed its own powerful kingdom centered at Napata near the fourth cataract of the Nile. The Nubians had absorbed Egyptian culture during centuries of colonization. They worshipped Egyptian gods, wrote in hieroglyphs, and built pyramids for their kings. They considered themselves the true preservers of Egyptian civilization, more authentically Egyptian than the divided, foreign-ruled Egypt to their north. Around 747 B.C., the Nubian king Pa decided to intervene in Egyptian affairs. He marched north with his army, not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of proper order, a defender of Ma'at, coming to save Egypt from the chaos of divided rule and Libyan usurpers. Pa's invasion is documented in one of the most remarkable texts from ancient Egypt, the Victory Stela, a massive stone monument erected at the Temple of Amun in Napata. The stela, standing over 6 feet tall and covered with hieroglyphic text, records Pa's campaign in vivid detail. The stela reveals Pa's character and his complicated relationship with the Egyptian identity he claimed. He was outraged by the condition of Egypt he found. The local Libyan rulers were not maintaining proper religious observances. They had neglected the temples. They were not circumcised, which for Pa was a sign of barbarism. These foreigners, he believed, had corrupted Egyptian civilization. Pa methodically conquered Lower Egypt, besieging cities, defeating armies, accepting the surrender of local rulers. The stela describes how he insisted on visiting the temples in every city he captured, performing the proper rituals, making offerings to the gods. He was not just conquering Egypt, he was purifying it, restoring proper order. When he reached Memphis, the ancient capital, Pa found the royal stables. The stela records his fury when he discovered the horses had suffered during the siege. Pa loved horses passionately, and the mistreatment of these animals genuinely outraged him more than some of the human suffering he witnessed. This detail, so unexpected and personal, makes Pa come alive across 27 centuries. Pa conquered all of Egypt, receiving the submission of the various Libyan pharaohs. Then, having reunited Egypt and restored what he considered proper religious observance, he did something remarkable. He went home to Nubia. He did not stay to rule Egypt directly. He returned to Napata, leaving Egypt under the nominal control of the local rulers, who now acknowledged him as overlord. This decision ensured Pa would be forgotten. He had conquered Egypt, achieved what no Nubian ruler before him had accomplished, yet he left no dynasty, no lasting presence. Later, Egyptians barely remembered him. Modern historians rediscovered him only when his victory stela was excavated in 1862. Pa's successor, Shabaka, took a different approach. Around 721 B.C., Shabaka invaded Egypt again, and this time stayed, establishing direct Nubian rule. He founded the 25th dynasty, also called the Kushite dynasty, after the Nubian kingdom of Kush. He moved to Egypt, ruling from Memphis, and worked to restore Egyptian monuments and temples that had been neglected during the Third Intermediate Period. The Kushite pharaohs, Shabaka, Shabitku, and Taharqa, were devout restorers of Egyptian tradition. They repaired temples throughout Egypt. They commissioned new religious texts and artwork, deliberately imitating the styles of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, trying to recreate the classical Egyptian aesthetic. They were more traditionally Egyptian than many native Egyptian rulers had been for centuries. Taharqa, ruling from approximately 690 to 664 B.C., was the most powerful of the Kushite pharaohs. His reign was long and initially prosperous. He built extensively at Karnak, adding a massive colonnade in the first court of the temple. He constructed temples throughout Nubia. His name appears on monuments from the Delta to deep in Sudan. But Taharqa's reign coincided with the rise of a terrifying new power, Assyria. The Assyrian Empire, based in Mesopotamia, had become the most powerful military force in the Near East. The Assyrians had developed new technologies of siege warfare and new tactics of terror. Cities that resisted were destroyed utterly, their populations deported or massacred. The Assyrian army was the most feared fighting force of its age. Taharqa made the fateful decision to support Syrian and Palestinian kingdoms in their rebellion against Assyrian rule. This brought the Assyrian army to Egypt. In 674 B.C., the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt, defeated Taharqa's army, and conquered Memphis. Taharqa retreated to Thebes, and later to Nubia. The Assyrians installed local rulers as puppets, and withdrew. Taharqa returned and reconquered Egypt. The Assyrians invaded again. This cycle repeated multiple times. Finally, around 663 B.C., the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal launched a massive invasion, capturing Thebes itself and sacking the ancient capital. The Assyrians plundered Thebes so thoroughly that prophets in the Hebrew Bible later used the city's destruction as a symbol of divine judgment. Taharqa died in 664 B.C., possibly of natural causes, or possibly of despair, watching his kingdom crumble. His nephew Tantamani briefly tried to restore Kushite rule, but the Assyrians crushed this attempt. The 25th dynasty ended. The Kushite pharaohs retreated to Nubia permanently, continuing to rule their southern kingdom, but abandoning their claim to Egypt. The Kushite pharaohs were remarkable rulers. They were foreigners who loved Egyptian civilization more than many native Egyptians. They restored temples, revived ancient art styles, and maintained religious traditions. They fought desperately to defend Egypt against Assyrian conquest, yet they are almost completely forgotten. Shabaka, Taharqa, and Tantamani are names known only to specialists. Their pyramids in Sudan are barely visited. Their monuments in Egypt are attributed to other periods or simply ignored. Why are the Libyan and Nubian pharaohs forgotten? Partly, it is because they were foreigners, despite their cultural assimilation. Egyptian historical memory was selective, remembering the great native dynasties and erasing or minimizing foreign rulers. Partly, it is because they ruled during a period of decline and division, a time Egyptians preferred not to remember. And partly, it is simply because their era was overshadowed by what came before the glorious New Kingdom and by what came after the final flowering of native rule before the Persian conquest. But their forgottenness is also a testament to the power of Egyptian civilization. These foreign rulers could have conquered Egypt and imposed their own culture, as conquerors usually did. Instead, they became Egyptian, adopting the language, religion, and culture of the people they ruled. They wanted to be pharaohs in the truest sense, not foreign kings but legitimate rulers of the two lands. And in becoming Egyptian, in being absorbed into Egyptian civilization, they paradoxically ensured their own historical erasure, remembered as brief interruptions rather than as the continuation of the pharaonic tradition they tried so hard to maintain. The Assyrian conquest was brutal but brief. The Assyrian Empire, stretched too thin across the Near East, could not maintain direct control of Egypt. They withdrew, leaving local rulers in charge as vassals. From this chaos emerged the 26th dynasty, also called the Sayet dynasty, after its base in the delta city of Sais. This dynasty, ruling from 664 to 525 B.C., represented the last great flowering of native Egyptian rule, a final sunset of independence before the night of foreign domination. The founder of this dynasty was Psamtik I, originally an Assyrian puppet ruler of Sais. As Assyrian power declined, Psamtik gradually asserted his independence. He unified Egypt, not through conquest, but through careful diplomacy and alliance building. By 656 B.C., he controlled all of Egypt, having peacefully absorbed or neutralized rival rulers in other delta cities and won over the powerful priesthood of Thebes. Psamtik I ruled for 54 years, from 664 to 610 B.C., one of the longest reigns in Egyptian history. His reign was peaceful and prosperous. He opened Egypt to Greek merchants and settlers, establishing trading colonies in the delta. Greek mercenaries served in his army. Greek artisans worked on Egyptian monuments. This cultural exchange revitalized Egyptian commerce and brought new ideas and technologies. Internally, Psamtik promoted what historians call the Sayet Renaissance, a conscious revival of Old and Middle Kingdom art styles, religious texts, and cultural forms. Sculptors were commissioned to copy works from 1,000 years earlier. Temple reliefs deliberately imitated ancient styles. It was as if Egypt, facing an uncertain future, was looking backward to its golden age, trying to recapture past glory through meticulous recreation. Psamtik I was a successful ruler who restored Egyptian unity and prosperity, yet he is almost unknown today. His name appears in no popular histories. His monuments are attributed to earlier or later periods. He has been forgotten, buried beneath the more dramatic stories of Egypt's conquest by Persians and Greeks. His son, Necho II, ruled from 610 to 595 B.C. Necho was an ambitious ruler with grand visions. He attempted to dig a canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea, a project that would have revolutionized trade between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. Ancient sources claim the project was abandoned after costing the lives of over 120,000 workers, though this number is probably exaggerated. Necho also commissioned a Phoenician expedition to circumnavigate Africa. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, the expedition succeeded, taking 3 years to sail down the east coast of Africa, around the southern Cape, and back up the west coast to the Mediterranean. Herodotus himself doubted the story because the sailors claimed that at the southern tip of Africa, the sun was on their right hand when sailing west, which would only be true south of the equator. Modern scholars believe this detail actually proves the voyage happened, as no one in the ancient Mediterranean would have invented such a counterintuitive detail. If true, this was one of the greatest exploratory voyages of antiquity, not repeated until the Portuguese circumnavigated Africa 2,000 years later. Yet Necho II is forgotten, his achievements unknown to most people. Necho also attempted to restore Egyptian power in Syria and Palestine, launching military campaigns against the rising Babylonian Empire. At the Battle of Megiddo in 69 B.C., Egyptian forces defeated the Kingdom of Judah, killing King Djoser. But 4 years later, at the Battle of Carchemish in 65 B.C., the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar decisively defeated the Egyptian army, ending Egyptian ambitions in Asia forever. The Sayyid dynasty continued, with Psamtik II and Apries, rulers about whom we know relatively little. Then came Amasis, who ruled from 570 to 526 B.C. Amasis was originally a general who overthrew Apries in a military coup. Despite his violent rise to power, his 44-year reign was peaceful and prosperous. He maintained close relations with the Greek world, donating funds to rebuild the Temple of Apollo at Delphi after it burned down. He married a Greek princess. Greek merchants flourished in Egypt under his protection. Amasis was the last successful pharaoh of independent Egypt. He died in 526 B.C., and within months, catastrophe struck. His son Psamtik III had barely assumed the throne when the Persian Empire, which had been conquering the entire Near East, turned its attention to Egypt. In 525 B.C., the Persian king Cambyses invaded Egypt with a massive army. At the Battle of Pelusium, near the eastern edge of the delta, the Persians crushed the Egyptian army. Psamtik III was captured and initially treated well, but when he attempted to organize a rebellion, Cambyses executed him. The 26th dynasty ended. Egypt became a province of the Persian Empire. The Persian domination, called the 27th dynasty by later Egyptian historians, lasted over a century, with one brief interruption. Persian kings ruled Egypt as absent pharaohs, governing through satraps, provincial governors who often exploited Egypt ruthlessly. Some Persian rulers, like Darius I, respected Egyptian culture and maintained temples. Others, like Cambyses and Xerxes according to Egyptian sources, were tyrants who looted temples and oppressed the population. Around 404 B.C., Egypt successfully revolted against Persian rule. What followed were the 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties, the last gasp of native Egyptian independence. These dynasties lasted less than 80 years total, their rulers constantly fighting to keep the Persians at bay. The 28th dynasty consisted of a single pharaoh, Amyrtaeus, about whom we know almost nothing beyond his name. The 29th dynasty produced several rulers who fought wars against Persia with varying success. The most important dynasty of this final period was the 30th, particularly its founder Nectanebo I. Nectanebo I ruled from 380 to 362 B.C. He successfully defended Egypt against Persian invasion, defeating a massive Persian expedition in 373 B.C. He built extensively, constructing temples and monuments throughout Egypt. His building projects at Philae, Karnak, and other sites were the last great flowering of traditional Egyptian architecture. His grandson, Nectanebo II, was the last native Egyptian pharaoh ever to rule Egypt. His reign, from 360 to 343 B.C., began with promise. He continued his grandfather's building projects, adding temples and monuments. But in 343 B.C., the Persian king Artaxerxes III launched another massive invasion. This time, Egypt fell. Nectanebo fled south, possibly to Nubia, and disappears from history. Egypt became a Persian province again. The age of the pharaohs, stretching back 3,000 years to Narmer's unification, was over. Never again would a native Egyptian rule Egypt as an independent pharaoh. The pharaohs of the late period, Psamtik, Necho, Amasis, Nectanebo, are forgotten despite their accomplishments. They maintained Egyptian independence during a time when empires were swallowing ancient kingdoms. They promoted art, culture, and commerce. They fought desperately to preserve Egyptian sovereignty, but they were swimming against the tide of history. The age of the great Near Eastern empires had begun, and small independent kingdoms, even one as ancient and prestigious as Egypt, could not survive. These last native pharaohs are forgotten not because they failed, but because their success was temporary, a brief defiance of the inevitable. The Persian reconquest of 343 B.C. was itself brief. Less than a decade later, a young Macedonian king named Alexander conquered the Persian Empire in one of history's most spectacular military campaigns. In 332 B.C., Alexander entered Egypt as a liberator, freeing the country from hated Persian rule. The Egyptians welcomed him as a savior. Alexander stayed in Egypt only a few months, but in that time he was crowned pharaoh in the traditional manner, visited the oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis, where he was proclaimed son of the god, and founded the city of Alexandria at the western edge of the delta. Then he marched east to continue his conquest of Asia. He would never return. He died in Babylon in 323 B.C. at age 32, leaving behind a vast empire with no clear successor. Alexander's generals divided his empire among themselves. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions and most capable generals. Ptolemy cleverly seized Alexander's body during its funeral procession and brought it to Egypt, where it was eventually interred in a magnificent tomb in Alexandria. Possessing Alexander's body gave Ptolemy enormous legitimacy, a physical symbol of his connection to the great conqueror. Ptolemy initially ruled Egypt as satrap, governor, but in 305 B.C., he declared himself pharaoh, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty. This dynasty would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, making it one of the longest ruling dynasties in Egyptian history. Yet, despite this longevity, most of the Ptolemaic rulers are completely forgotten, overshadowed by the dynasty's final queen, Cleopatra VII. Ptolemy I, called Ptolemy Soter, meaning Ptolemy the Savior, ruled until his death in 282 B.C. He was a capable administrator and military leader. He consolidated control of Egypt, acquired territories in Syria and Asia Minor, and made Alexandria one of the greatest cities in the Mediterranean world. He founded the Library of Alexandria, which would become the most important center of learning in the ancient world, housing hundreds of thousands of scrolls and attracting scholars from across the known world. Ptolemy I also established the pattern his dynasty would follow. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt as Greek kings, speaking Greek, maintaining Greek culture, but adopting the external forms of Egyptian kingship. They were crowned as pharaohs with traditional Egyptian ceremonies. They built temples to Egyptian gods in traditional Egyptian style. They appeared in Egyptian art wearing traditional pharaonic regalia. Yet in Alexandria, in their palaces and among their Greek subjects, they were Hellenistic monarchs no different from the rulers of Syria or Macedon. This dual identity, Greek in culture but Egyptian in ideology, characterized the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies created a 2-tier system: Greek language and culture for the ruling elite, Egyptian language and religion for the native population. The two worlds rarely mixed. Greeks and Egyptians lived side by side but separately, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, following different laws. The Ptolemaic succession followed a pattern both stable and deeply disturbing. To keep power within the family and prevent rival claimants, the Ptolemies practiced brother-sister marriage. This was an ancient Egyptian royal tradition, but the Ptolemies took it to extremes. Nearly every Ptolemaic pharaoh married his sister. Their children would marry each other. The genetic consequences of this repeated inbreeding were catastrophic, leading to physical and mental disabilities that plagued later generations. Ptolemy II, called Philadelphus, meaning sibling lover, married his full sister Arsinoe II. This marriage shocked the Greek world, where such unions were considered incestuous and taboo, but the Ptolemies claimed they were following Egyptian custom. They deified Arsinoe after her death and established a cult in her honor. Ptolemy II's reign from 282 to 246 B.C. was prosperous. The Library of Alexandria flourished. Trade expanded. Alexandria became the wealthiest city in the Mediterranean. Yet Ptolemy II is forgotten, his accomplishments unknown outside academic circles. The dynasty continued through Ptolemy III, IV, V, and onward, each numbered Ptolemy blending into the next in historical memory. There were occasional queens, Cleopatra and Arsinoe, Berenice and other names, but they too are largely forgotten. The dynasty became infamous for its internal violence. Brothers murdering brothers, mothers killing sons, children overthrowing parents. The palace intrigues of Alexandria were Byzantine in their complexity and brutality. Ptolemy VIII, ruling intermittently between 170 and 116 B.C., was nicknamed Physcon, meaning potbelly, due to his obesity. He married his sister Cleopatra II, then married her daughter Cleopatra III, making his wife also his niece. When Cleopatra II revolted against this arrangement, civil war erupted. Ptolemy murdered his own son by Cleopatra II and sent the dismembered body to the mother as a birthday present. This level of cruelty and dysfunction became typical of the late Ptolemaic court. As the dynasty progressed, the Ptolemies became weaker. Internal family conflicts drained resources and stability. Rome, the rising superpower of the Mediterranean, increasingly interfered in Egyptian affairs, supporting rival claimants and extracting concessions. By the 1st century B.C., Egypt was nominally independent but effectively a Roman protectorate. The dynasty's end is well known because of its final ruler, Cleopatra VII, who ruled from 51 to 30 B.C. Cleopatra is one of the most famous figures in history, known for her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, her political acumen, and her dramatic suicide after Mark Antony's defeat by Octavian at the Battle of Actium in 31 B.C. Cleopatra was the first Ptolemaic ruler to actually learn Egyptian. For 3 centuries, the Ptolemies had ruled Egypt without speaking the language of their subjects. Cleopatra's linguistic ability gave her a connection to native Egyptians that her ancestors lacked. She styled herself as the new Isis, the embodiment of the Egyptian goddess, and promoted herself as Egypt's savior from Roman domination. But Cleopatra's fame obscures an important truth. She was the last and least significant ruler of a 300-year dynasty. The Ptolemies who came before her, Ptolemy I, II, III, and onward through the 14th, ruled during Egypt's prosperity and power. They built the Library of Alexandria, the Pharaohs lighthouse, magnificent temples at Philae, Edfu, and Dendera. They made Alexandria the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean. Yet all of them are forgotten. We remember Cleopatra, who ruled during Egypt's final collapse, not the earlier Ptolemies who made Egypt great. History has a cruel irony. It remembers failures and endings more vividly than long periods of success. When Cleopatra died in 30 B.C., Octavian annexed Egypt as a personal possession of the Roman emperor. Egypt became a Roman province, its grain feeding Rome, its wealth flowing into Roman coffers. The age of the Pharaohs was truly over. The Ptolemies, despite being Greek foreigners, were the last rulers to claim the title of pharaoh, to be crowned in Egyptian ceremonies, to build Egyptian temples, to maintain the forms of kingship that stretched back 3,000 years. When Cleopatra died, that tradition died with her. The forgotten Ptolemies, with their Greek names and their Egyptian crowns, their incestuous marriages and their magnificent libraries, were the final chapter in the long story of pharaonic Egypt. We have journeyed through 3,000 years of Egyptian history, meeting dozens of pharaohs whose names have been erased from popular memory. The question now is why? Why are some pharaohs immortal, while others, sometimes more accomplished, are completely forgotten? The most obvious answer is monuments. The pharaohs we remember are those who built structures so massive, so impressive, that they could not be ignored. Khufu built the Great Pyramid, the largest stone structure ever constructed. It dominates the Giza Plateau and has stood for 45 centuries. You cannot forget the man who built that. Ramesses II covered Egypt with monuments proclaiming his name. He built more temples, erected more statues, carved more inscriptions than any other pharaoh. He plastered his name over earlier rulers' monuments, claiming credit for their work. His self-promotion was so successful that even today, when people think of ancient Egypt, they often picture Ramesses. By contrast, the forgotten pharaohs left little or nothing. Some built monuments that crumbled. Userkaf's pyramid collapsed into rubble. Sekhemkhet's was never finished. Some built in locations now remote and rarely visited. The Kushite pyramids in Sudan are magnificent, but barely known because few tourists travel there. The second factor is treasure. Tutankhamun would be completely forgotten if Howard Carter had not discovered his intact tomb in 1922. The golden mask, the elaborate grave goods, the sheer spectacular wealth made Tutankhamun instantly famous worldwide. Yet by ancient standards, Tutankhamun was an insignificant pharaoh, a boy king who ruled briefly during troubled times. The forgotten pharaohs' tombs were robbed in antiquity. When archaeologists find them, they contain nothing but bare walls and empty sarcophagi. No treasure means no publicity, no museum exhibitions, no public fascination. The third factor is ancient propaganda and selective memory. The Egyptians themselves forgot or deliberately erased pharaohs they considered illegitimate. Hatshepsut's monuments were defaced, her name chiseled out of inscriptions. The Hyksos were written out of history as much as possible, their achievements minimized, their very existence presented as a shameful aberration. The Amarna period pharaohs Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, Tutankhamun, and I were deliberately excluded from official king lists because they were associated with the heretic Akhenaten's religious revolution. Later pharaohs wanted to pretend that period never happened. The fourth factor is the accident of archaeological discovery. We know about Sekhemkhet only because Zakaria Gonim happened to notice an unusual depression in the sand at Saqqara in 1951. How many other pharaohs remain buried beneath the sand, their pyramids or tombs undiscovered, their names lost forever? Ancient papyrus records have almost entirely perished. Stone monuments survive, but papyrus turns to dust. The bureaucratic archives that would have detailed the reigns of countless pharaohs are gone. We have king lists preserved on stone, giving us names and reign lengths, but these tell us nothing about what these pharaohs actually accomplished. The fifth factor is historiography, how history has been written and taught. Western education has traditionally focused on the most dramatic periods, the Old Kingdom pyramid builders, the New Kingdom Empire, and Cleopatra's death ending Egyptian independence. The intermediate periods, the late period, the foreign dynasties, these are glossed over or omitted entirely. Greek and Roman historians wrote extensively about the Egypt they knew, the Ptolemaic and early Roman period. But they knew little about earlier Egyptian history. Relying on Egyptian sources they often misunderstood. Herodotus visited Egypt around 450 B.C. and wrote about what he saw and heard, but his information about earlier periods was often legendary or confused. The modern rediscovery of ancient Egypt in the 19th and 20th centuries focused on the spectacular, the pyramids, the Valley of the Kings, Tutankhamun's tomb. Museums wanted impressive objects to display. Archaeologists sought dramatic discoveries that would make headlines. The forgotten pharaohs, with their modest tombs and crumbled monuments, offered neither. The sixth, and perhaps most important factor, is the weight of time. 3,000 years is almost incomprehensible. Egyptian civilization lasted longer than the time separating us from ancient Rome. The Old Kingdom is as distant from Cleopatra as Cleopatra is from us. No human memory can retain 3,000 years of detailed history. Only the most spectacular moments survive in collective memory. The forgotten pharaohs are forgotten not because they were unimportant, but because history has a cruel selectivity. It remembers extremes: the highest pyramid, the longest reign, the greatest military victories, the most dramatic collapses. It forgets the competent administrators, the peaceful rulers, the maintainers of order who governed well, but built no wonders. Yet these forgotten pharaohs were the foundation of Egyptian civilization, the early dynasties that created the bureaucracy, writing system, and religious ideology, the Middle Kingdom rulers who restored order after chaos, the 17th dynasty heroes who fought to liberate Egypt from foreign rule, the late period pharaohs who maintained independence in the face of rising empires. Without these forgotten rulers, the famous ones could not have achieved what they did. They deserve to be remembered. And perhaps, in telling their stories tonight, we have rescued them, at least briefly, from the oblivion of 3,000 years. Our journey through 3,000 years has come to an end. We have met the forgotten pharaohs, the pioneers like Den and Hotep Sekhemwi, who forged the first dynasties, the builders like Sekhemket and Kaaba, whose pyramids never rose, the warriors like Sekenenretau and Kamose, who died fighting for Egypt's liberation, the foreigners like the Hyksos and Kushites who ruled Egypt and became Egyptian, the last defenders like Nectanebo who fought desperately against inevitable conquest. These rulers governed one of the greatest civilizations in human history. They maintained Ma'at, cosmic order, for generations. They built temples and led armies. They kept the Nile flowing and the harvests coming. They were divine kings, gods on earth, yet they were also human, capable of both greatness and failure, remembered by fate more than merit. The forgotten pharaohs remind us that history is not just the story of the famous. Behind every pyramid stands a dozen unfinished monuments. Behind every remembered king stand dozens whose names are lost. The foundation of civilization is built by countless hands, most of them anonymous. Tonight, we have given voice to the voiceless, memory to the forgotten. Their monuments may have crumbled, but their achievements endure in the civilization they built, maintained, and defended across millennia. Thank you for listening. It has been a privilege to guide you through this hidden history. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.